Hello, we are transmitting to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century. Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost. Whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you. This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 767.EZ0104, certificate number 31561, the Maury Island Incident.
Who are you? Really?
Really? I am just a figment of your imagination.
Loren, welcome to the Omnibus.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here.
I know you are reporting to the Omnibus Project from very near to me, although we would think of it here in the Northwest as you were being, you're way out in the country.
Way out in the country, yeah.
Fully 40 minutes from where I'm sitting, but you've got bears in your backyard.
Do indeed, yeah.
Yeah. And we had a nice conversation in our pre-show addenda talk. But you are a Northwest native and a Tacoman.
Yes, absolutely. Born and raised and through.
From Tacoma definitely carries a lot of weight around here. I'm from Tacoma. It's not a thing that people would say casually. It's not a thing you say to earn like status, although maybe recently it's become a thing.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It's a great place to be from. That came off really snarky. It was not intended.
Praise.
Everybody I love lives down there. And it's a great place. If there was, if I had a job down there, I'd probably be living down there. And great town. And I encourage any of our Omnibus listeners who are visiting the Pacific Northwest, if you leave Tacoma off your itinerary, you're really missing out.
It's absolutely true. The downtown of Tacoma is like Seattle. It's built on a hill, and so there. If you had one direction, you kind of can walk along fairly even streets. But if you head in another direction, you're in a San Francisco state of mind where you're really climbing.
Yeah, without the cable cars.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this the other day. Is there any? I know Tacoma has redeveloped and made into a park the whole waterfront north of town up to Ruston. Yeah. But right there, the harbor, the area around Johnny's Dock, it feels ripe to be made into something kind of more than what it is.
I think that's already underway. There are some condos and apartments there, and they have artist lofts that are reserved for people who are engaging in creative pursuits. And I think you're already starting to see the very thing you're alluding to is already starting to happen. There's a real vibrant arts community down there, as you probably know. Good music, really diverse cultures, and it's a great town. If you're familiar with George Francis Train, kind of a bon vivant from the 1800s, he lived there for a while, and he's the guy who coined the term City of Destiny. And he was the model for the character Phileas Fogg.
Really?
Yeah. He did a round-the-world trip to prove that Tacoma was the closest point to anywhere in the world. And he did it. He didn't do it in 80 days. He did it in 67 days. But he left from downtown Tacoma and returned to the spot. And there's a plaque there to this day commemorating his circumnavigation.
No kidding.
No kidding.
Tacoma is the closest place to everywhere, was his premise.
That was his premise, yeah. He was trying to sell real estate in Tacoma, so, but yeah, that was, it was, the terminus of the, the Northern Pacific Railroad, and was really was felt as, it was going to be the city of destiny on the bay.
Well, that destiny still awaits it.
It's coming. It still has a better harbor than anywhere else in Puget Sound, and great transportation. And it's a great town.
You're a Northwesterner, and you are, from our conversation, fairly steeped in Northwest lore. You've worked across a lot of fields, but very, very Northwest oriented. Do you think of yourself that way?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. With a brief stint off world, I spent my entire life here. And
wait a minute, you had a time on an off-world colony?
No, I was in the service for a few years and spent some time away. And short of that, though, I spent the rest of my life here. And yeah, I do. I think I've been affiliated with some of the really big companies and organizations that have shaped the area. And so I think just kind of by osmosis have sort of steeped in the lore.
Well, so as a Northwesterner, steeped in the lore of the Northwest, which is, I think, we live in a particularly spooky part of the United States.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Probably one of the spookiest parts if you think of all the, everything that sort of coalesces here. Yeah. What do
you attribute that to?
I think there's probably a number of factors. I think for one thing, there is a lot of genuinely unusual stuff that goes on here, right? You've got some major military bases. We are one of the furthest outposts, Alaska notwithstanding, in the continental U.S., and I think there's been, I think there's a lot of things that implies. I think, again, you've got these, if you talk about spooky things like Bigfoot and stuff like that, we have these dense forests and gloomy weather. And I think all these things kind of coalesce. And then you just have the people out here, right? People came here originally to get away from everything else. And people who live like that, tend to be storytellers and oddballs and cranks. And I think some of that contributes to it a lot too.
It's one of the things that I like about it here, the fact that it does feel a little bit mysterious, even simple things, even small places out where you live in Snoqualmie Valley. You wouldn't think that it was American Gothic, but it's extremely American Gothic out there.
Yeah.
The fog settles on the land, and it just feels like there are specters rising up out of the fens, And also, you growing up in Tacoma would know about the Asarco smelter and all of the serial killers that it apparently produced.
That's the most recent hypothesis in that book that came out about which I grew up in the shadow of that smelter. So what therefore there but the grace of God go I guess. It was pumping pollutants and arsenic and everything else into the atmosphere on a daily basis. And it was our growing up in Tacoma, it's your North Star. I think anybody wanted to know where North was, you looked and here's this huge smelter, and if you couldn't see the stack, you could see the smoke coming out of it.
Right, that's how you told which way was north. Interesting.
Yeah.
I saw some graph the other day that said that we specifically, Generation X, but early Generation X, were the kids most exposed to lead and arsenic and heavy metals in the air, in the food, in the water. Like it peaked right around 1968.
When my kids were little, the Asarco smelter had been closed for some time. Took the kids to what was left of Never Never Land. If you're old enough to remember Never Never Land down in Point Defiance Park, it was a little fairy tale,
Yeah.
you know, and there wasn't much left of it. I thought I'd take them to see what was left. They still had the old woman and the shoe. They didn't have the characters, but they still had the shoe, and it had a slide in it, and kids could play in it. But there were big signs all around this little play area that said, "Warning: Do not touch or consume the dirt." So there's still, I don't know if those are still up, but that was, Point Defiance Park was very much in the shadow of that plume.
Yeah, I dated a girl that lived there in Ruston, and as a little girl, she said when the ash started to fall on the neighborhood, all the mothers would run out and call their kids in because the particulate that fell down would burn the paint off the hoods of their cars.
Yeah.
And that's how the mothers knew, like, don't play when it's raining soot.
Yeah. Well, and interestingly, the Asarco smelter plays a minor role in our story today. So,
well, go on. Tell me more.
Well, let me start with a question.
All right. Good.
When you think of the phrase flying saucer, what comes to mind? What kinds of things come to mind?
Well, of course, being our generation, I can't help but think of the Brady Bunch episode where I think it's Greg or one of the younger Bradys is throwing a Frisbee in the yard or something like that and makes a movie of it. But I do know a little bit the history of flying saucers kind of coming, that legend starting here in Washington State by Mount Rainier.
We'll get into all that. Yeah.
Yeah. And, weather balloons and Project Blue Book. And we grew up in a time when UFOs were really along with the Bermuda Triangle and quicksand and Bigfoot, it really felt like they were on television a lot and in Time Life books.
Yeah.
They were part of our childhood, really. The unexplained was a big part of being a kid in the 1970s.
Yeah. And I think that before the 70s, there was a transition, I think probably took place in the 60s where, what we call UFOs now or UAPs now, right, is back then they pretty universally called them flying saucers. And that phenomenon, started here. When you mentioned, the Seattle area, the Puget Sound area being, kind of a nexus of weird stuff, the phenomenon definitely started here, at least as something that was outside of pulp sci-fi magazines, right?
Yeah.
And it started in 1947. 1947, they called it in the popular press back then the Summer of the Saucer. And it started with the report of, a pilot named Kenneth Arnold, who was, flying his plane over Mount Rainier. He was looking for a military craft that had gone missing, and there was a reward for finding it, the location.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So he had his radar up, he was definitely looking for something, and he saw something. He saw what he described as a string of 9 objects. He did not call them disc shaped. That came later. But they were traveling very fast. They were in formation. And he described them as skipping a saucer across the water. That's how he described it. And that's where the term flying saucer came from. The press coined them as flying saucers. They weren't actually saucer shaped in his report. He described them as chevron shaped, kind of like almost, if you've seen the flying wing airplane that was, that you see it in Indiana Jones, right? It kind of looked like that as he described it.
It was an era of civil aviation too, right? There were a lot of pilots back from the war and.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. A lot of people out and a lot of surplus craft and that sort of thing, that were being repurposed. The Kenneth Arnold sighting attracted some attention because Kenneth Arnold was a serious person. He wasn't a crackpot. And he told a very cogent, comprehensible story, and and he wasn't ascribing anything to it. He wasn't claiming he saw aliens or anything like that. He just very straightforward told the story, and so it really captured the public's imagination. and of course not just the mainstream press, but also then the pulp press we talked about before, right? So there was an editor, Ray Palmer, who had Amazing Stories magazine, and Amazing Stories wanted to cover it as well, and they really blew it up into a bigger thing.
And did Fort Lewis at that point have an active, I know there probably wasn't McChord Air Force Base yet, but did it have an active air base, and were they doing any kind of testing of experimental craft?
So McChord was there. It was McChord Airfield then, I believe it was called. And whether they were testing experimental craft or not, I don't know. I think that, you mentioned, weather balloons or what I think, you mentioned. The military was absolutely experimenting with, they had a project called Project Mogul, you may have heard of. Mm-hmm. That is what ultimately accounted for what the official story now is, and probably is the case what it was that crash landed in Roswell. And I think what Arnold described could be consistent with something like that. But there were other things in the air. Project Mogul was a series of these arrays of balloons that were lined up that were designed to acoustically detect Soviet nuclear bombs, right? Mm-hmm. Which they didn't have yet, but we were certain they were going to get it. There were a series of sightings down the coast. Like I said, they called it the Summer of the Saucer, and it turned into kind of a crazy flap where people were reporting things all over the place. But there was sort of this consistent chain of sightings down the coast, ranging from about Seattle area down to about Roswell area. And it could have been our own Mogul balloons. It could have been something else. Could have been aliens. I don't know. Arnold saw something, and he was, like I say, he wasn't somebody who was written off as sort of a crackpot or anything like that.
And what he claimed was it was these objects were really hauling,
really moving faster than a plane could have been moving. And he's an experienced pilot. He had a pretty good sense of what the capabilities were out there, and he had his eyes open, not just because he was looking for the crashed aircraft on Mount Rainier, but he's looking for other. Want to make sure he didn't run into other pilots because he wasn't the only one out there looking. And so it was a bit of a sensation and spurred a whole lot of other copycat reports, crank reports, and other people who were reporting very similar things who were also very sober, accounts.
Over the years, I've had counseling multiple times, and when you find a psychologist that you develop a relationship with, it's really like an important and meaningful part of your life. You go to the doctor for your physical ailments. Why shouldn't a psychologist also be part of your routine? Not to say that you go to a psychologist only for your ailments, but a psychologist is a key component of a healthy life, I think. And my relationship with my most recent psychologist, and it came to an end because my insurance changed, and my insurance didn't cover that psychologist. He wasn't in network, and rather than go through the labyrinthine process of finding a psychologist that did take my insurance, that was in my neighborhood, that were even, within an hour's drive, it was just overwhelming. And as a result, for the last couple of years, I haven't been seeing anybody. And I feel like it's a missing component of my life. And that's why I've been so sort of gratified and intrigued to discover Rula. Rula does this psychologist search very differently. A lot of online psychology search companies or psychology pairing companies, they don't deal with insurance companies at all. And so you end up just having to pay for your sessions, which are prohibitively expensive for most of us. Rula partners with over 100 insurance plans, and they work to make the average copay for a session just $15. You're getting real therapy from licensed professionals at prices that make sense. Again, just like the way psychology is component to going to see a practitioner, an internist for your physical well-being, why wouldn't your psychology be also covered by your insurance the same way that your doctor is? And the experience of your psychological or your counseling session should be tailored around you. Rula tries to find the right fit between you and what are a great variety of psychologists on the platform. So they offer in-network covered care. Average copay, as I say, is $15. Depending on your benefits, your copay could be as little as $0, which is there are few costs lower than $0. Rula helps you find the right therapist. They have a network of over 15,000 therapists and psychiatrists nationwide. And they have true end-to-end care. Rula is committed to supporting you every step of the way. They want you to succeed, basically. And they help monitor your progress in therapy. So thousands of people are already using Rula to get affordable, high-quality therapy covered by insurance. Visit Rula.com, that's RULA.com/omnibus to get started. I can't recommend this highly enough, and if you've never had therapy, don't knock it until you've tried it. Don't be suspicious of it. And this online process that Rula offers, lets you test the waters and see if therapy is right for you, which I imagine if you find the right therapist, it's right for everybody. So go to Rula.com, RULA.com/omnibus. You deserve mental health care that works with you and not against your budget.
So in the wake of this, Ray Palmer of Amazing Stories magazine reached out to Arnold and said, "There's another sighting in your area that's really interesting to us, and would you be willing to go to Tacoma and investigate this, look into this for us?" And he took the job. He got $200 to go to Tacoma to investigate this. That was about $3,000. That's not a bad day's work for going and talking to somebody. And this sighting, this is what's known as the Maury Island incident. I'll just tell the story, and then we can kind of unfold how it unfolds. But there was a man on his boat with his son and his dog, and maybe not a couple of crewmen. He's often described as a harbor patrolman. That's in dispute.
maybe or maybe not a couple of crewmen? Like, that seems something easy to establish.
Nothing is easy to establish in this story. This story starts out with a UFO sighting and then gets really weird. So if that gives you any idea of the direction this thing went. The way the story is usually told about the crew members is it's written in a weird way in the report. It says, Harold Dahl, his son, were on this boat with two crew members. And I think most people who've looked at this a lot think the two crew members were Dahl and the son. I think there were ever only two people on this boat. But they reported seeing off of Maury Island. And this is, not far from where you are right now, as you know.
No, Maury Island, I mean, I see it almost every day. It's just right there.
Yeah, it's right there in the middle of Puget Sound. It's a tied island with Vashon Island, connected to Vashon by a tombolo, little strip of land. And
that was an artificial strip of land, right? The locals threw a bunch of seashells and dirt in there and connected the islands.
That's right. And so Dahl was probably salvaging logs. As you know, back in those days, you had these big log rafts. That's how warehousing the other companies got the big logs out. And sometimes logs would go missing, and the timber companies would pay, if you recovered one. And
it was one of the first words I said. We lived on the water there in Kingston, and the log patrol boats.
Yeah.
Would come into the bay looking for rogue logs. Yeah. And I, as a toddler, stood there and looked out and pointed and said, Katuga boat trote. And that became part of our family lore. Katuga boat trote.
Katuga boat trote, yeah.
Was me trying to say log patrol boat.
Yeah. So Dahl was a tugboat tote. What is it?
Katuga boat trote.
Captain, yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And it was a very blue collar activity, because, you got whatever the reward was for returning the log, or you knew somebody who was willing to pay more for the log. Right. So, it was a practice. It wasn't a super official practice, but they were definitely out there. He was out on his tugboat chote.
Good. Perfect. You're saying it exactly right.
And he saw 6 objects floating in the air above him and moving at some speed. And they started to slow down and came down over his boat.
Oh.
And one of them appeared to be in some kind of distress, as he described it. Another one came to its aid, right? If you can imagine, one comes down and sort of connects with the other. And the one that seemed to be in distress expelled some kind of material that he described as, first there was a papery aluminum type material that came down, and then a lava-like material. And he said the lava material broke his son's arm. It hit so hard, their boat broke his son's arm and killed their beloved dog that was also on the boat. And then once they discharged this material, all 6 of them flew off. And that was the end of the sighting.
I have never heard this story. This happened just like a mile from here.
Yeah. If you go down to downtown Des Moines,
which is right there. I was there yesterday.
Yep. Then you missed this. There is a mural depicting the entire episode in downtown Des Moines.
You're kidding me.
I'm not. I'll share photos that you can take a look at. But yeah, you can Google them if you want. There's just Maury Island mural in Des Moines, and you'll find pictures of it. It shows this whole story in one big mural form.
I'm going to go there this afternoon.
Interesting side note, just for the way this thing unfolds. In between conversations with Chrisman and Dahl, Arnold and Smith got a call at their hotel room from a reporter, and they said, "Well, we're working on a story. We're not going to give you a scoop." And the reporter said, "I'm not calling to get information. I'm calling to give you some information." He said, "I have got reports of what you guys are talking about, and I've got word for word transcripts of things you guys have talked about in your room." The implication very much being that the room had been bugged. And the reporter really did not want to do the story so much as just kind of tip these guys off that there's something weird going on in room 502 of the Winthrop Hotel. But there's a really important element to this. After the Air Force pilots get there and do their investigation, and Chrisman brings them a cornflakes box full of stuff that supposedly came out of UFO. They looked at it, and this is where the smelter comes in. It looked like smelter slag, industrial slag, and old airplane parts, things like that. And they very politely, said, "Okay, we're about done here. We got to get back down to California." On the way back to California, their plane crashed, and both of the pilots were killed. And this suddenly became a big deal. Then
Whoa.
The FBI got involved. And, at that point, Harold Dahl, the captain, said, the whole thing's a hoax. None of this really happened. And Fred Chrisman sent a letter saying, "I've been abducted to a military prison in Alaska."
Whoa. So Dahl goes one way. Sorry, I was just kidding. Let me out of here. And Chrisman doubles down.
Yeah. And so the FBI gets involved, and it becomes a much bigger thing. And so much that has been written about this over the years has been, embellished or interpreted that sometimes it's kind of hard to separate what really happened from what didn't happen. But what we do know is a couple of Air Force pilots died, and it turned it into a whole other kind of story. Which I think it's important at this point now. I think maybe you go back and why was Amazing Stories even interested? Why was Chrisman the guy doing the talking and all this? And it turns out Chrisman was not unknown to Amazing Stories. Mm-hmm. He was he had told some amazing stories himself over the years. So how familiar are you with the Shaver Mysteries? Is this a term that...
I am not at all familiar with the Shaver Mysteries.
How about Lemuria?
I've heard the term Lemuria.
Okay. So the Shaver Mysteries were... Richard Sharp Shaver was a character who told a lot of stories to pulp magazines, particularly amazing stories, about his understanding of the hollow earth and the people who lived therein.
Right. Lemuria. We've discussed that on the omnibus as part of the hollow earth. Right?
Correct. And Richard Sharp Shaver, I'm not going to say he had mental issues, but he got his Lemuria stories when his welding equipment on his job talked to him and told him these stories.
Right.
So,
that checks out.
Yeah. So they became a real phenomenon in Amazing Stories, and the most popular series of, he would tell these lurid stories about what life was like in the caves. And people would write in and share their own stories, and and one of the letters they got was initially anonymous from an individual who claimed that when he was a fighter pilot during World War II, he and his partner crash landed and went into the caves and had a battle with the Deros, which were the detrimental robots in the Lemurian mythos, right?
The
Deros, detrimental robots. These were alien type creatures that were bad guys that you had to fight. So he battled. The Harper's Magazine later used that letter in a story about cranks, people who write crazy stuff into publications. At which point, the individual wrote another letter and signed it. It was Fred Chrisman. Talked about his battles with the Deros both in Burma and later in Alaska. And
was Fred Chrisman verifiably a pilot for the U.S. Armed Forces in the war?
He was verifiably a pilot. He wasn't a fighter pilot. He was, I think, more of a transport pilot, the kind of stuff they would have done in Burma back then.
C-47 over the
that
hump.
Sort of stuff. Yeah. He definitely was. But he liked to inflate his, resume a little bit, as people are known to do. And part of his inflation of his resume was his battles with the Lemurians, right? And
that's quite an inflation of his resume.
Yeah. And
I wonder if it qualifies him for an additional tack onto his pension or something.
I don't. This is one of the big questions. All these stories that surround Fred Chrisman is why he even did this, right? It didn't seem to be anything more, as near as I can tell, than you wanted to get people to pay attention, I suppose. But Palmer at the time said, if you have more stories like this, let me know, but you have to bring proof. And, and then a year or so later, then the Maury Island incident occurs. I want to give a shout out, to, there's a filmmaker who's making a documentary about Chrisman right now. His name's Brian Shickley. He's already made a short film, an animated film called Cave of the Space Nazis, which tells the Lemurian episode of Fred Chrisman. And Chrisman is played by Pat Cashman in the animated.
Pat Cashman of Seattle, no kidding.
That's right. And it's a great piece. I encourage people to seek out Cave of the Space Nazis. It's a great little film.
Will you break down for me for just a second? Obviously I've heard of the magazine Amazing Stories my whole life, and I can think of a lot of the cover illustrations of Amazing Stories. I mean, I have a very clear picture of the title, the kind of font that Amazing Stories magazine used as their logo. But I always assumed that Amazing Stories were just published, pulp fiction, sci-fi short stories, that it was all part of the sci-fi fiction craze. But are you saying that Amazing Stories was more like the Fortean Times, or it was actually publishing what it claimed were real accounts? It was a it sent reporters out to investigate?
Oh, yeah. It definitely walked the fine line between, outright fiction and, and some true life stuff. It probably was closer to the genre of what they used to call men's magazines.
Yeah, right.
Like Saga and Fate, where they would, men would tell their war stories, or crime fiction and those sorts of things. So it had a lot of that element about it, but it leaned heavily into sci-fi. But he usually tried to give it a gloss of this really happened, and so it was more in that vein.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm reevaluating my idea of what Amazing Stories is, and here we go.
Yeah.
Heading on.
It's funny that, because this is a genre that, or a type of writing that continued and probably still continues to a certain degree. I don't know if it's as much now. I remember back when I worked at Cairo Radio, we would interview people whose stories would end up in like the National Enquirer. And their bar for whether or not to include something as a true story was, could they get somebody on record, right? Could they get somebody, to say, yes, this happened to me? That was close. That was good enough for them, right?
Yeah, right.
And I remember we interviewed somebody a woman who'd been a Northwest woman, which is why we were interested in it, who'd been abducted by Bigfoot. And she tells this crazy story in the National Enquirer. And we interviewed her on the air. And after she tells her story, the interviewer said, "So how much did the National Enquirer pay you to share this story with them?" And she said, "They didn't pay me much." I've always loved that,
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of that going on in Ray Palmer's world, where tell me a little bit more about what happened, in your words.
Yeah, right. Well, and I guess the big question of this has always been, how much are these serious people that start off at the top of your story, and we see throughout the UFO craze, that are airline pilots and military officers and people with a lot of credibility, how much are they really enticed by these $500 checks in an envelope to completely, ruin what you would consider to be their reputations and their credibility as people?
I think that's interesting to think about. And I think, on the one hand, a paycheck's paycheck, right? The other thing is, once you have said something like this, I don't think you can ever unsay it. You think about somebody like Emil Smith, a United Airlines pilot. As soon as he says he saw something, he's the pilot who saw something. And so he's going to have to decide, do I need to walk that back at some point and get back to being a pilot? Or do I lean into it and go to UFO conferences and write magazine articles, right? It's interesting with Chrisman, because he still stayed involved with the UFO community to a certain degree, but he branched out into other areas as well. He wrote a lot, and in fact, that's how I first heard about him. I was in a used bookstore down in Tacoma, and I found this book, "Murder of a City, Tacoma," and it's this sort of weird self-published thing. It was written by somebody named John Gold. John Gold was Fred Chrisman. And it even says so on the jacket of the book. It's he was a radio. He had a stint as a radio provocateur on a small station in Puyallup back in the 60s. And he wrote this book. He'd gone on after Maury Island. He actually went back in the Army for a while. He went to Korea and did some flying there, and was discharged again with major head injury, which may have had a hand in some of this too. But then he went into teaching and went from job to job. And Murder of a City, Tacoma, I have a copy of it here. It's a weird book. And the thing that stands out, and I think is important from a historical perspective, is that it's written in this very weird prose that he used. He'd use a lot of insinuation, a lot of bombastic language, and it's very distinctive reading. And you can see it in the letters he wrote to Amazing Stories as well. There's this sort of weird implying things, but nothing you could pin him down on.
The book you just held up is Spiral Bound. Is that how it was published?
No.
Oh, okay.
I have thumbed this a lot until it fell apart. It was. I remind you, it was self-published and didn't stand up to a lot of this. So this has been blown out and re-spiraled. So
got it.
But yeah, you can still find copies from time to time. But it's a weird little piece, and it's an important original document in, of all things, JFK assassination lore. The Garrison investigation that's highlighted in the movie JFK it's the prosecution of a businessman called Clay Shaw. And in real life, Clay Shaw did get indicted and tried for the murder of the president. You get your one phone call when you're arrested, right? Mm-hmm. Clay Shaw's first phone call was to Fred Chrisman.
No.
and Chrisman ended up getting subpoenaed by the Garrison grand jury. And he claims in his book that I didn't know anything about it, why they would pick on me, why they would get this school teacher / talk show host, from Tacoma and, drag me all the way down. He wouldn't go until they paid his way. They paid him $500 to go down there for the grand jury, which again, that's $5,000 in today's dollar. That's a pretty good chunk of change. You stay in a nice hotel in New Orleans for that. But what they based his, calling him in and was something called Garrison was in receipt of something called the EZ papers. Today in JFK lore, you hear about the EZ papers. Mm-hmm. And it talks a lot about, some of the conspiracy and that sort of thing. I've read the EZ papers and I recognize the prose.
Oh, wow.
It was clearly written by Fred Chrisman. It goes on for pages and pages diagramming the entire life of Fred Chrisman, his entire career, and explains why, in these papers, as a CIA operative, why he moved from job to job. He was ordered by the CIA to quit a job after a period of time. He describes himself as, he uses the term disruption agent.
Oh, dear.
He's hired by the CIA to go into these organizations, schools, and he worked at Boeing for a while to mess things up, and to keep things on, on uneasy terms for some reason. But he's clearly the author. You can't you don't have to be some kind of textual analysis person. It's the same language, and he's talking about things that only he could know. But he implicates himself in the conspiracy, and then goes down there, and he talks to the grand jury for an hour because he clearly wasn't involved. His anything against him or anything of value he has falls apart, really quickly. But I mean, he would do little things to make himself look like he was more involved in the happenings in the world than he really was. Right. So, for instance, he appointed himself the head of something called the CIA in Tacoma, the Civic Improvement Association, right? And then,
so he could get business cards made.
And he had his own little newspaper that he published called the New Tacoma Times, that he would publish things about that, about the CIA and the exploits of Chrisman, and then publicly resigned from the CIA, writing a letter to himself, as near as anybody could tell. He did a lot of that, writing letters. He would write letters about Fred Chrisman signed F. Lee. Well, his name was Fred Lee Chrisman. F. Lee would write letters talking about this disreputable character, Fred Chrisman. I mean, he was a weird guy by all accounts. In a lot of ways, he was as different from Arnold as anything. Arnold's story got taken seriously because he was a serious, sober individual. And by all accounts, Chrisman was at best blowhard drunk. He claims that there was an assassination attempt on him during the Kennedy business. Right. He did report being shot at the day he got his subpoena, and there are photos of his car with big bullet holes in the windshield. Now,
Yeah, right.
I don't want to disparage my hometown, but it doesn't take a lot to get bullet holes in your windshield.
Lol. Well, it sounds like if you're ready to write letters to yourself denouncing yourself, it's also easy to just stand and shoot 2 bullet holes into your windshield. Right. Just take me back to the beginning of this. Did Dahl report the UFO sighting before Chrisman arrived? And then all of a sudden Chrisman appeared as a result of the Amazing Stories connection, or was Chrisman there from the inception?
I get the impression that Chrisman was there from the inception. And again, bear in mind, lots of lore has attached itself to this. Either Dahl saw all this, Chrisman helped him tell the story, and there was an astonishing UFO incident over Maury Island in 1947.
Right.
Or Dahl didn't see anything. Chrisman said, hey, here's a chance to maybe make a few bucks or get some attention or be part of this whole phenomenon. And being part of this whole phenomenon seems to be something that Chrisman really likes, right?
Yeah,
so
you're right. But Arnold's story didn't get tarnished by his association with this. I mean, it's not generally listed as a hoax, is it?
No, Arnold's not at all. Or to this day, Arnold's is kind of, it depends on where you stand with UFOs, right? People who are really serious about UFOs take it very seriously because he was a serious person. People who think UFOs are, made up or whatever, kind of reserve judgment, I think. It seems clear just from the credibility of the person that he saw something, right? The question is what he saw. And usually when people try to explain away Arnold's sighting, they've talked about maybe he saw reflections of, in his window or something like that. Right. He claims that was a complaint in his day. And he said, no, I opened the window and looked out. It was a little Piper Cub or something.
Yeah. Right. You can open the window on a Piper Cub.
Yeah. And, he never got tarnished with it. And he was, like I say, he was treated, very much as just a reporter investigator on this one, so he didn't end up bearing the weight of any embarrassment over this.
And so did Chrisman ever it would seem like this kind of fabulism would result at some point in him getting actually prosecuted or tackled by real men in black.
He addresses that in his book. He talks about, and in letters, he said people say things, but why haven't they done anything about it? He claims about Maury Island, they say I got investigated and that, I should have been prosecuted. He says, well, why didn't they prosecute me? And I think probably the reason they didn't, it probably wasn't worth their trouble. I think they saw it as, it was case closed. It was tragedy. The accident obviously had nothing to do with them beyond, that's the reason they were in Tacoma.
As far as we know.
Right. And he says the same thing about his battle with the city government, is like, they say I'm, maligning people, he's very, very close to, if not over the line of slander and libel with the stuff he used to say and write. But he says that's the way they feel about it. They can sue me and nobody has. And so, but I think part of it was he really didn't, as near as I can tell, never really did much beyond talk. Right. And, he always, I think the recurring pattern throughout his life was trying to make himself look bigger than he was, which I think is kind of a shame because I think being a transport pilot during World War II, specifically a decorated one, something to be proud of, but I think he wanted more. He did things like, get advanced degrees from a diploma mill so that people could call him doctor.
Right.
He was a bishop in the Universal Life Church, which, is not,
Hey, careful! I have been ordained by the Universal Life Church,
as have I, and
also I have a lot of weird diplomas around here. I'm a Kentucky colonel. I've got I'm not far from this guy.
I think that may be why this story is intriguing to me. I think there's a little bit of that in all of us, right?
Yeah, right.
I could probably tell this story in a bar and maybe get somebody to buy me a cold one, but. I chose to tell it here because it's kind of fun to take it to a bigger stage. And I think he was always looking for a bigger stage.
And when you think about this being the origin of Men in Black and flying saucers, part of the appeal of those ideas is that they actually aren't that hard to imagine somebody just kind of sitting and thinking up. Like Men in Black, that's pretty obvious. Guys in suits with dark sunglasses, and saucers seem like a thing that would fly more easily even than a chevron. I mean, what were some of the other things that he invented?
I made a little list because I just thought, once I started working on it, it's like, these are things that didn't really exist in the public consciousness until this incident, right? This is really, like I said, this is the first time people reported to see saucer-shaped items. There had been, flying, right? There had been fiction about it, but this is the first time somebody claimed to have actually seen them in the sky. This is the first time UFOs left something behind. I think in that, close encounters of the blank kind, I think that's a close encounter of the second kind or third kind. This is the first report of the Men in Black story. First time there was a federal investigation of UFOs. Certainly the first FBI. And when you think about echoes of things like the X-Files, the FBI being deeply involved in this kind of thing, this kind of lore started here. We were talking earlier about the new Spielberg movie, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the lore that enters into that starts here. The notion of government cover-up, the idea that the government would try to hide something, because that very much came into play both with the Man in Black incident and with the investigation of the plane itself. They claimed that, they're not telling you it came down because the debris was on there, right? Really this was the prototype for the, this sort of X-Files type, cover up, the language of conspiracy and federal interest in this sort of thing that you see in everything from Close Encounters, E.T. You remember there were the
for sure, the man with the keys.
Yeah, the new one, right? The Men in Black movies, right? All owe themselves to this. But a lot of the things that we were, that correspond to paranoia, government cover-ups, they really kind of start here. And a lot of it, both because of the nature of the incident itself and the fact that I think Chrisman did a lot of work to keep these things alive by writing his crazy letters, having them published in magazines or sent to officials. He frequently would implicate himself by sending letters to, government officials signed by other people telling him to watch out for Fred Chrisman. He's a dangerous man. And, it's an odd thing to do, but if you're trying to build a mythos around yourself, I guess, that's one way to do it.
It's hard to fathom that, because this stuff it really has a lot of people held captive. It's very easy to populate that worldview with evidence of all kinds. Anytime something happens that you don't like, you can attribute it to secret forces at work, and it links in with the protocols of the Elders of Zion and the notion that the world is being controlled by secret groups, and it's so difficult to fathom that so much of it could be tied to one. And Chrisman seems like both a nut and also a carnival barker, or somebody who isn't a nut at all, but is a savvy self-promoter, and that whatever that line is between like literally deluded and savvily presenting oneself as deluded.
Well, there are a lot of there's a lot of people like this, and that where you can point to things that are in out there in the culture that started with fabulists or people, and a lot of them are mentally ill. I think Richard Sharpshaver very clearly was. Carl Allen, he goes by Carlos Allende. He's the guy who came up with the Philadelphia experiment, if you remember. Had mental issues, but there's a whole mythos that's grown up around him. There's Preston Nichols who came up with the Montauk. It was sort of an extension of that time travel thing. Chrisman's a little different. Like I said, I don't think he was necessarily. He seemed to want to look for unusual things that were going on and then try to figure out how he could become part of it. You mentioned you mentioned some of the paranormal stuff. You don't think he didn't dabble in that sort of thing too. He got fired from a teaching job in Oregon for forming secret societies with students. And I looked this one up because this was a new one to me, even looking into this. This society was called the Para-Ray Society, and they were very much studying spooky action, and it was he got fired for that. According to the Easy Papers, the CIA urged him to move on to mission accomplished at that school and on to the next one.
Right, it might be the CIA that he had as the Civic Improvement Association.
That's right. But here's another funny thing about this that just blows me away. Chrisman, his world that he kind of created continues in some forms even today. There was a documentary miniseries on one of the streaming networks recently called The Octopus, and it was about the murder of a journalist named Danny Casolaro. You may be familiar with this one. He was researching something called what he called the Octopus, which was a government business cabal that was had their fingers in a lot of different things. And there was an individual one of the main sources for that was somebody named Michael Riconosciuto, who had created by his account a software product called Promise that had a way of surveilling Americans, right? And this Promise software was tied up with a company called Inslaw, and there ended up being a lawsuit over it. And investigating the Inslaw story, which I won't go into at length, but just know that it involves conspiracies and government and everything else. This Danny Casolaro was investigating it and got murdered while he was investigating. Michael Riconosciuto blew the whistle on this and said he got murdered because of the Inslaw thing. And shortly after that, he was arrested and imprisoned for drug manufacturing. What's interesting is, if you'll remember, we talked about bugging hotel rooms and that sort of thing. Michael Riconosciuto, when he was a kid, he grew up in Tacoma, and he was covered in the local newspaper as early as when he was 12 years old as an electronics genius, boy genius electronics kid. And who he did his electronics work for was Fred Chrisman. And he himself grew up to be one of these fabulists. And again, it's very hard to separate anything that he says. He's still alive. He was interviewed in this documentary, and he's a very by all appearances, paranoid person. I spoke to the guy who's creating the documentary about Chrisman, and he's been working with Michael Riconosciuto, and says he's very hard to pin down on things, which I imagine Chrisman was like. But he was definitely associated with Fred Chrisman. His Riconosciuto's dad was Fred Chrisman's best friend in Tacoma. So why he would sort of adopt the same modus operandi, I don't know, or the same way of being, I don't know. But it's just weird that even now, 50 years after Chrisman passed away, there's still echoes of his approach to the truth that are prevalent in our society.
If you think about William James's book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, he talks about throughout history how many prophets and inspired religious kind of what we think of as, I mean, there's a very fine line between a maniac, for lack of a better term, and someone who becomes a saint and a prophet, because they often behave very similarly. And most of the individuals that move religion forward and develop new sects and become elevated as some of the holiest people, they begin as apostates and people that are ostracized because they're so unconventional, and it's only later that we beatify them as people that had true inspiration. There's varieties of religious experiences, an interesting book in that way. But I often think of people like Chrisman. Throughout history, they have been, people that are having schizophrenic episodes end up being the ones that we beatify, and their portraits or their statues end up in front of the Vatican. And I think there's something about modernity now where we no longer are talking about spirits and the hand of God, but we're talking about machines and monsters and more than anything, like governments and systems of power and control that are effectively, what are these things? They're just angels appearing in the sky, interpreted by schizophrenics as being these other things. And it's I guess the familiar saw or canard of UFO investigators. Either we've been seeing UFOs for thousands of years and misinterpreting them as angels, or maybe a doll saw angels and misinterpreted them as weather balloons and saucers.
I think about things that people take for granted that that they know but they don't know the true origin of the thing that they're taking for granted, right? I think even people who aren't terribly interested in UFO lore or aliens or alien life or anything like that, they know the outlines. They know the basic outlines. We may be being visited by UFOs. The government may be trying to keep us from knowing that. There are powerful forces that are controlling us that we don't. It's so that is such a baked in part of our lore now that people make movies and TV shows and books about these kinds of things
and policy decisions potentially.
Right. And yet what they don't know is the true origins of how these things even got started, that they started in the mind of some individual who had an agenda that's beyond knowing.
Right.
And the story grew bigger than the person. And, I think there's a lot of things like that throughout history where, you mentioned religious movements. I don't want to disparage anybody's religion, but some of them probably did start out this way. Somebody saw something unusual, told a story, somebody else exaggerated it, somebody else built on that. And suddenly you've got a huge mythos, people living their lives by it, and they may not fully understand or comprehend what really it sits on. And at some point, if you get far enough away from that, does it even matter?
And that concludes the Maury Island incident. Entry 767.EZ0104, certificate number 31561 in the omnibus. Futurelings, it's quite clear that almost all of social media is so impossibly infected by the dreams of Mr. Chrisman that none of it is credible, none of it is where you should spend your time. I mean, I think now with the fact that we no longer can even trust photographs and video, I think we're headed very quickly to a place where we're just sitting around a fire, playing drums that we made ourselves and telling stories about things that we actually saw with our own eyes. That seems to be, it's honestly the case, Loren, that this entire episode, you could have just been a generated, fictive
How would you
bot.
know?
How would I know?
Yeah.
Right? And it's certainly in a year from now, I could be doing half my Omnibus episodes with Soviet agents, or like Chinese disinformation bots. And I'm here like, oh yeah, totally. Just like, merp, merp, merp. And so I think the only place that you really can trust on the internet are places where futurelings congregate, because futurelings would be impossible with technology the way it is, impossible for a bot to emulate, because they are such an eclectic group of people drawing from, such disparate influences that how would a bot even know how to compile a futureling? Right? Like what are the ingredients? Like I think it would, you couldn't fake it, right? And so I suggest, if you are on the internet and you have yet to pull the plug, Google futurelings and find them on Discord, Reddit, Facebook, etc. But really, you can count on the Omnibus Project to continue to be a source of veracity and integrity. You can email us at theomnibusproject@gmail.com. You can hang out on our website. It's not really a place to hang out, but you can visit our website at omnibusproject.com. You can submit, as Loren did, a proposal for a show to omnibusproject.com/submit. Go there and fill out the forms, and Grant will eventually be in touch with you. I don't know how long it took. How long did it take you, Loren, to get for Grant to reach out?
Months, but I had stuff to do, so it was fine.
Yeah, good. Hopefully, if you want to come on Omnibus, you also have other stuff to do. In the meantime, you can watch this show at youtube.com/@theomnibusproject and see the two of us here in our Northwest houses chatting away. Always interesting to watch. And you can send us actual physical mail, care of the Omnibus Project, to 609 Southwest 150th Street, number 48084, Burien, Washington, just one town away from Des Moines, Washington, where the mural resides, 98166-9998. And then finally, you can support Omnibus and also watch a half-hour-long interview that Loren and I did before the show, where we really, really dig into some Northwest deep, like we're basically going block to block in Tacoma, like, oh, yeah, that place has good milkshakes. You can visit us there at patreon.com/omnibusproject.
Futurelings. From our vantage point in your distant past, we have no idea how long our civilization survived. We hope and pray that the catastrophe we fear may never come. If the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may have been our final word. But if Providence allows, we wish you many goods and cheese and hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the Omnibus.